Have you noticed how to make decisions can be an internal battle? On the one hand, the fear of the unknown on the other, the hope that everything will work out. The truth is that we often want guarantees before acting, but life doesn't work that way. God invites us to trust Him with all our hearts, even when the answers are not clear. Uncertainty may be scary, but what if I told you that it is one of the greatest tests of faith? When we look at the Bible, we see heroes who made difficult decisions without having all the answers. David, when consulting the ephod, Jonathan, challenging an enemy army with only one squire, and even Moses, who had to advance before the Red Sea opened. Faith has always required action, but trusting God does not mean crossing the arms and waiting for a miracle without doing our part. True faith walks hand in hand with obedience and spiritual wisdom. Often the divine answer does not come as a thunder of heaven, but through God's direction, wise advice, and even closing doors. The challenge is to learn to discern His voice amid the noise of life. And that is exactly what we will explore in this text. How to make decisions without absolute certainty, how to act even in the face of doubt, and how to trust that God is conducting every step. Let's dive on this journey and find out together how to apply Proverbs 3 and 5 in a practical way in our daily lives. Making decisions is never easy, especially when we are facing choices that can change the course of our lives. Everyone has their own way of deciding. Some make pros and cons lists, others ask for advice, and there are those who simply follow intuition. But for those who trust God, there is a better way to seek His orientation. This is how David, in the face of challenges, used the ephod to consult the Lord. He not only trusted the divine direction, but also made decisions based on this certainty. Uncertainty is part of the walk of faith, and it is normal to be afraid to face the unknown. But God has not called us to live in doubt. He wants us to learn to trust in Him, even when the path seems hazy. David's story teaches us that consulting God is not a passive act. On the contrary, it is a movement of faith that puts us in tune with His will. The secret is not only to ask for guidance, but also to be willing to obey, even when the answer is not what we expected. Often God does not give us all the answers immediately. He teaches us to depend on Him, step by step. Imagine if David had only advanced when he was absolutely sure of victory. He would never have faced Goliath, conquered kingdoms, or seen the miracles of God in his life. Faith requires us to make decisions even without all the puzzle pieces. Trusting in the Lord means moving on, even when the scenario looks uncertain. Making decisions in faith does not mean acting impulsively, but to balance wisdom and trust in God. This involves prayer, study of the Word, and search for spiritual discernment. Many people wait for an extraordinary sign before they move, but God also speaks through circumstances, advice, and inner peace. If your decision is aligned with His principles, you can advance without fear. However, it is important to remember that each choice has consequences, and this is part of the growth process. Even when we make mistakes, God uses our failures to teach us and strengthen our relationship with Him. Faith is not a shield against difficulties, but the certainty that, regardless of the result, God continues in control. What He wants is a heart willing to trust and learn, regardless of what ahead. What if, instead of waiting for a clear and definitive answer, would we learn to walk with God in the midst of uncertainty? The great truth is that our journey of faith is like this, one step at a time, trusting that He is guiding us, even when we do not see the full picture. In biblical times, priests used Urim and Thummim to seek God's direction in times of uncertainty. These objects, whose meaning refers to light and perfection, were used to obtain divine answers to important decisions. But the answer was not always clear or immediate. This teaches us something deep about faith. Trusting God does not always mean having an instant revelation, but learning to walk with patience and trust. Imagine you need to make an urgent decision and not have an exact answer. This was the dilemma that Israel's leaders faced when using Urim and Thummim. Sometimes God gave a clear direction, other times, silence was the answer. This teaches us that the wait is also part of the process. God is not an oracle who answers every question at the time we want, but a Father who teaches us to trust Him, even when we don't have all the information. Today we do not have Urim and Thummim in hand, but we have something even greater: the presence of the Holy Spirit, which guides us in each decision. God's direction can come through the Bible, wise people around us, or even situations that confirm or close a way. The challenge is to learn to discern this voice in the midst of the noise of our own anxiety. Faith requires patience, and waiting for God's right time is an exercise of deep trust. We often want God to give us a yes or no immediate for every decision, but He wants us to develop spiritual wisdom. This means learning how to make decisions aligned with His principles, even without a miraculous answer. The truth is that God gives us direction, but also expects us to use discernment and responsibility in our choices. It is a partnership of trust and action. Faith does not eliminate the need to think and seek advice. On the contrary, trusting God also means resorting to resources that He has already made at our disposal: the Word, prayer, and the faith community. Urim and Thummim remind us that God speaks, but also that we must be prepared to accept His answers or His apparent lack of response with maturity and perseverance. What if, instead of waiting for a supernatural sign with each decision, we would learn to walk with God in everyday life, trusting that He is guiding us even when the path seems uncertain? True faith not only depends on immediate answers, but on a continuous relationship with the One who has all the answers. Faith is not an abstract concept, it manifests itself in practice. Jonathan and his squire are a classic example of how to trust God requires movement. They faced a Philistine army without a guarantee of victory, but they advanced with the certainty that God could act. This is the secret: faith and action walk together. It's no use just believing, it is necessary to take concrete steps towards what God has placed in our hearts. Many people paralyze in the face of uncertainty, waiting for absolute confirmation before acting. But faith has never been about human certainties, it is about trusting God's character. Jonathan did not have a clear view of the outcome of battle, but he knew that God was powerful to intervene. This attitude teaches us that we will often only see God's action after we take attitude. He wants us to move, even without seeing it all the way. This means that instead of waiting for a perfect moment, we need to learn to obey God in the present time. Maybe He has put a dream in your heart, but you are waiting for guarantees before you act. The problem is that waiting too much can become an excuse for ever leaving the place. Faith is not spiritual procrastination. If God has given a direction, move on, even if the details are not completely clear yet. Taking initiative with faith does not mean being reckless, but learning to balance confidence and wisdom. Jonathan himself did not attack any way. He observed, made a strategy, and, above all, put his confidence in God. This teaches us that acting by faith does not mean ignoring preparation. We need to study, plan, and seek discernment, but without letting fear paralyze us. The Bible shows us that God honors those who take steps of faith. Moses only saw the sea open after he walked toward Him. Pedro only tried walking on the waters after he left the boat. The principle is the same for us. The supernatural happens when we combine confidence with action. It is not enough just to believe, it is necessary to demonstrate this faith through our attitudes. What if the answer you expect from God only came after you took the first attitude? Faith requires courage to act without all the answers. Perhaps your next step is not to see the whole way, but simply trust that God has already prepared the ground ahead. After all, true faith reveals itself in practice, not just in words. None of us lives isolated. Our decisions are influenced by those around us. Seeking the right orientation can be the decisive factor between a wise choice and a disastrous error. Proverbs 11:14 says that in the multitude of counselors there is security, and this is no wonder. When we are facing important decisions, having people who seek God's direction by our side can prevent us from acting impulsively and guiding us for choices more aligned with His purpose. The problem is that not every advice is good. We often follow the opinions of people who, although well-meaning, have no spiritual discernment. Look at the Roy Chain story. He ignored the wise advice of the elders and followed the guidance of inexperienced friends. Result? His reign was a failure. This shows that it is not enough to seek advice. It is necessary to seek advice from those who have maturity and spiritual wisdom. Having mentors and friends with God makes all the difference. Advice based on the Word can open our eyes to something we had not considered. And that doesn't mean completely dependent on others' opinion, but using these conversations as a compass to help us discern God's direction. Sometimes a simple question from someone wise can make us reflect and see a path we had not noticed before. In addition to seeking advice, it is important to surround ourselves with people who encourage us in faith. If we live only with people who doubt, criticize, and discourage us, our faith can weaken. But if we have by our side those who remind us of God's character and drive us to trust in Him, our courage grows. The Christian walk is not lonely. God calls us to grow in community, strengthening each other. So choose your references well. Who are the people who most influence their decisions? Have they approximated or removed from God? A practical way to grow in this area is to seek discipleship, to be involved in a group of faith, and learn from people who have tread the way before you. Wisdom is often acquired by experience, and learning from the journey of others can save us from many unnecessary errors. What if, before making a big decision, would you stop to hear advice from someone who really has intimacy with God? It can be a leader, a mature friend in faith, or even a book written by an experienced one. What matters is remembering that we don't have to make decisions alone. God puts right people in our way to help us see more clearly. Many people think that trusting God means waiting for Him to do everything without having to move. Others think that everything depends exclusively on them, without the need to seek divine direction. But true faith is a partnership. God is part of Him, and we do ours. He gives us promises, but expects us to walk toward them. Balance is trusting, but also acting. Abraham received the promise that he would be the father of a great nation, but he had to leave his land and pilgrimage without knowing exactly where he went. Moses received the call to free the people of Israel, but had to confront Pharaoh several times before seeing the miracle happens. David was anointed king, but still had to face challenges and battles until he took the throne. None of these promises was fulfilled instantly, all required action. This teaches us that God always is part of Him, but hopes that we will be active partners in the process. If He put a dream in his heart, maybe the next step is not just to wait, but to prepare. Want a new job? Pray, but also send resumes. Do you want a healthy relationship? Seek God, but also develop the qualities that a relationship needs. Faith is not passivity, it is trusting while moving. We often hope God gives us 100 of the answers before we act, but He calls us to walk in faith, even without seeing the whole route. When Joshua led the people to the Jordan River, the waters only opened after the priests wet their feet. That is, the miracle came after the action. God acts, but He honors those who take the first steps. This 50-50 partnership also reminds us that we are not alone. Often the journey of faith seems lonely, but God strengthens us in every step. He gives us direction through the Word, circumstances, and peace in the heart. Our responsibility is to be attentive and willing to follow this guidance. Faith is not just believing in miracles, but aligning our lives with divine principles and taking attitudes according to them. And if, instead of waiting for the perfect scenario, you decided to act today, trusting that God is guiding your steps, the secret of faith is precisely in this advance, even without seeing the full picture, knowing that God is working with you. If there was a manual with all the answers to each decision we need to make, life would be much simpler, wouldn't it? But God did not give us a detailed script. He called us to trust Him even without having all the certainties. Faith always involves a certain degree of risk. We often need to act based on a perhaps, believing that God is in control, even without a visible guarantee of success. A great example of this is when Jonathan said to his squire, "Perhaps the Lord help us." 1 Samuel 14:6. He was not absolutely sure that he would win the battle against the Philistines, but decided to advance by faith. And what happened? God intervened and guaranteed the victory. This teaches us that faith does not expect certainties to act. If Jonathan had expected clear confirmation before moving, he would have missed the opportunity to see God act. Expecting a total guarantee before making a decision may be a trap. If Moses had expected a detailed explanation of how to cross the Red Sea, the people of Israel would have been trapped in Egypt. If Peter had waited a map about how to walk on the waters, he would never have left the boat. The point is that often God only shows us the next step after we take the first. Making decisions without absolute certainty does not mean acting irresponsibly. God has given us wisdom and discernment, and we must use them. Before acting, we can seek guidance in the Word, pray and ask for advice from wise people. But at some point you will need to trust, and move on. God may even open doors, but we need to cross them. The truth is that faith teaches us to walk in the dark with the confidence that God has already prepared the way. If we always wait for supernatural confirmations before each choice, we can end up paralyzed by uncertainty. The Christian life is not about avoiding risks, but about trusting that even if we make mistakes, God can redirect us. He does not abandon us in the process. He walks with us. And if, instead of waiting for absolute certainty, you trust that God is already guiding your steps, perhaps the only thing that is missing for the answer to arrive is your decision to move on. After all, faith is not about seeing the final destiny, but about trusting that God is in control of the journey. The walk of faith has never been to be lonely. From the beginning, God designed the human being to live in community, supporting and being supported. When we face challenges, doubts, and uncertainties, be surrounded by people who share the same faith strengthens us and gives us discernment. The Bible teaches us that just as iron sharpening iron, man sharpens his companion. Proverbs 27:17. That is, we grow spiritually when we are connected to others who help us stay firm. A big mistake that many make is try to solve everything alone. The enemy always wants to isolate us because he knows that loneliness weakens. When we face spiritual battles, we need the intercession and support of those who share our faith. Just look at the early church. Christians gathered, shared life, and strengthened each other. This model remains essential for us today. In addition to emotional and spiritual support, the community also brings responsibility. Being surrounded by people who know us prevents us from making impulsive decisions or deviating from God's way. Friends and spiritual leaders can warn us when we are about to make wrong choices and remember God's promises when we are discouraged. Faith is a battlefield, and fighting alone makes war much more difficult. However, being in the community also requires effort and humility. We often avoid connecting because we do not want to be vulnerable. But the truth is that no one is strong all the time. Sharing our struggles and asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. God often uses people around us to give us answers, encouragement, and even correction when necessary. If you are not yet part of a community of faith, this can be one of the most important steps to strengthen your walk. This can be through a local church, a biblical study group, or God-fearing friends with whom you can count on. The important thing is to be surrounded by people who drive you to grow and to trust God more. What if, instead of trying to solve everything alone, would you start building relationships that strengthen your faith? Communion not only protects us against falls, but also multiplies our strength. After all, when we walk together, we face any battle with much more resilience. Faith is not just an internal belief, it manifests itself through our actions. James went straight to the point in saying, "So the faith, if you have no works, is dead by itself." James 2:17. That is, believing in God without acting according to this faith is like having a car. Without fuel, it doesn't take anyone anywhere. Trusting in God implies taking concrete steps towards what He called us to do. Unfortunately, many people confuse faith with passivity. They pray, wait, but don't move a finger for things to happen. Imagine if Noah had heard God's voice over the flood, but never began to build the ark. Or if the disciples had received the call of Jesus, but they had never dropped their nets to follow Him. Faith always requires action. This does not mean that our actions replace the grace of God. On the contrary, they are a response to the faith we already have. When we trust God, our posture changes. We come to seek opportunities to serve, to grow spiritually, and to impact the world around us. True faith is not just in discourse, it transforms our routine, our relationships, and even our daily choices. Often the lack of action is linked to fear. We want signs, certainties, and guarantees before we move. But faith teaches us to act even when we do not have all the answers. If God has put something in your heart, start small. Take the first step, even if it seems insignificant. The important thing is not the size of the action, but obedience to what God has already revealed. An act of faith also manifests itself in care for others. James reminds us that it is no use saying go to peace, warm up, and feed well without really doing something to help. Faith drives us to be an answer to one's prayers. Small gestures, such as a word of encouragement, an act of generosity, or a time dedicated to listening to someone, may be the manifestation of God's love in someone else's life. What if, instead of just waiting, would you start acting in faith today? Perhaps what is missing to see God's act is just that transforming your faith into motion. After all, faith without works has no life, but when we put into practice, it becomes a powerful instrument to manifest God's purpose. Faith and risk have always walked together. Looking at the Bible, we see that God rarely gave his servants all the answers before they gave the first step. Abraham left his land without knowing where he went. Peter walked over the waters without guarantee that he would not sink, and Esther risked his own life to intercede for his people. The great lesson? Following God requires courage to act, even when the path seems uncertain. Many people want to live by faith, but without giving up security. The problem is that God does not always call us to predictable ways. Trusting him involves leaving the comfort zone and facing the unknown. This does not mean acting irresponsibly, but understanding that faith challenges us to leave human control and depend on the supernatural. The question is, are we willing to take a step without seeing the floor? In real life, taking risks in faith can mean a lot of things: starting a new project without having all guarantees, investing in a relationship even without knowing the future, changing city through God's direction, or simply obeying a call that seems impossible. Fear will always be present, but faith teaches us not to be dominated by it. If we are waiting 100 sure, we will never leave the place. Of course, this does not mean that every risky decision is based on faith. We need to discern between acting by faith and acting on impulsiveness. God does not call us to jump on purposeless cliffs, but to trust when he asks us to walk in unknown ways. The secret is to seek God's direction, prepare, and when the right time comes, act without hesitation. The Bible is full of stories of people who have taken risks to fulfill God's purpose. What if David had retreated before Goliath? If Moses had said no to the mission of freeing Israel? If Mary had refused to be the mother of Jesus? They all faced giant challenges, but decided to trust. God honors those who have the courage to move, even when there are no human guarantees. What if, instead of focusing on what can go wrong, would you start looking at the possibilities that faith can open? Perhaps what is missing for a new chapter of your life is no longer information, but simply a step of boldness. Faith is not having everything under control, it is trusting that God already has. Faith is not reserved for the great moments of life. It must be present in the small decisions of everyday life, in the way we deal with challenges, we treat people, and face the unknown. We often think of faith as distant, linked only to extraordinary miracles, but in reality it manifests itself in daily choices. The question is, how can we live by faith in a practical way? First, we apply faith by trusting God in daily uncertainties. When we face financial problems, challenges at work, or family dilemmas, we have two options: act in desperation or trust that God is in control. This does not mean ignoring the problems, but dealing with them with the certainty that he sustains us. Small acts of trust, such as praying before an important meeting or giving God a concern, are ways to exercise faith. Moreover, faith leads us to make decisions based on spiritual principles, not just passing emotions. In today's rapid world, it is easy to take shortcuts or act impulsively. But whoever trusts in God learns to wait for the right time, to act wisely, and to seek advice. Applying faith in everyday life is asking, is this in line with God's values? Before making large or small decisions. Another important aspect is the way we treat people. True faith manifests itself in love, patience, and generosity. Jesus taught us that our faith must be visible in our attitudes, helping those who need, forgiving, being righteous at work, and showing compassion in everyday life. It is no use talking about faith if it does not transform the way we live. Faith also encourages us to dream and act, even when we do not see immediate results. Perhaps you are expecting a change, professional growth, or a response from God. The practical application of faith involves continuing striving, studying, working, and preparing, even without seeing the immediate fruit. The farmer plants the seed before seeing the harvest. Life with God works the same way. What if, instead of seeing faith as something theoretical, would you begin to see it as a lifestyle? Each choice, every word, and each attitude can be an opportunity to demonstrate confidence in God. After all, Living by faith is not just about waiting for great miracles, it is about recognizing that God is present and active in every detail of our journey. Making decisions in faith will never be an easy way, but it is a transformative journey. Trusting the Lord with all your heart, as Proverbs 3:5 teaches us, requires more than just believing, requires action, patience, and courage. God guides us, but also expects us to do our part, taking risks, seeking wise advice, and surrounding us with people who strengthen our journey. You may be in a moment of uncertainty now. There is an important decision before you, and the answer does not seem clear. What to do? The first step is to remember that God is already in control, even when you do not see. He may be teaching you how to trust, to mature spiritually, or simply expect you to take a step of faith before revealing others. Ask yourself, am I waiting too much without acting? Or am I acting without looking for God's direction? The answer can completely change your way of facing the challenges of life. Faith is not absence of doubt, but the decision to trust even in the midst of them. If this content spoke to your heart, share it with someone who may need this message. And to continue learning more about faith, decision-making, and spiritual growth, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. Thus you receive more content that can strengthen your journey with God. And now, are you ready to take the next step in your walk of faith?